Hey there, everybody! It's time once again for another episode of Cave Cat's movie and TV reviews. Once again with your favorite host, the one and only Cave Cat. Are you ready to get into episode 13 of this review series? If the answer is yes, then you're gonna love today's episode. This review is a little bit different from all the other reviews I've done in the past, because for this franchise, I will review each and every one of the first 9 shows of the franchise individually in one video. So in other words, I will give short reviews for each show here. The franchise in question? That would be none other than Scooby-Doo. Yup, there's no denying the popularity of this franchise, which was first produced by Hanna-Barbera back in 1969. With all the shows that had churned out throughout the years, as well as inspiring other shows to hop on the bandwagon, Scooby-Doo proved to be the most popular cash cow to have ever existed ever since its inception. There are other cash cows that people regard very highly, such as Sesame Street, Super Mario Bros., Garfield, Pokemon, Digimon, and especially The Simpsons and SpongeBob SquarePants. However, in the case of the latter two, a lot of people have been wanting those two franchises to end. But unfortunately, it seems like that's not ever going to happen due to the company CEOs wanting them to keep going until the end of time. Yeah, Scooby-Doo may be a cash cow, but at least they've been able to churn out new shows once every few years instead of every year. But anyway, it's time to talk about each and every one of the first 9 Scooby-Doo shows, so here we go! The first show ever released was Scooby-Doo Where Are You?, which was first released back in September 1969 and ended in October 1970. However, the show wasn't always the way that it was now, because originally Hanna-Barbera tried to make it an animated series focusing on the main characters in a band called Mysteries 5, where the main characters made a living as a rock band, and when they weren't performing at gigs, they would be out solving various mysteries. However, the executives did not agree with the rock band aspect, which prompted Hanna-Barbera to go back to the drawing board and retool the show, renaming it Who's Scared, as well as getting rid of the rock band aspect. Though somehow I can't help but feel that that working title might have inspired Big Idea to title the first episode of VeggieTales Where's God When I'm Scared. But moving on, the executives also rejected that proposal due to the fact that the title might turn kids off from watching the show. So Hanna-Barbera was forced to go back to the drawing board again. Also around that time, Scooby-Doo wasn't always named what he is now. When the show was still in production, he was originally called Too Much, until the producers at Hanna-Barbera decided to change his name to Scooby-Doo, taking the name from hearing Frank Sinatra's Strangers in the Night, which contained his ad-lib Scooby-Dooby-Doo solo. So that inspired the producers to rename the show to Scooby-Doo Where Are You? And tone down the more scary aspects of the show, as well as adding more comedy to lighten the mood, while still keeping the mystery-solving angle. I also mentioned this before in my Scruffy review, but Joe Ruby and Ken Spears, who would later become the founders of Ruby Spears Productions, are actually responsible for helping to create and develop Scooby-Doo into what he is now. This time, the executives greenlit the show and it aired on CBS back in September of 1969, as I've mentioned earlier. So what do I think of the very first Scooby-Doo show? It's actually very good. It's a great way of establishing each of the main characters and how they're portrayed in each and every episode, whether they're Scooby himself or even his 4 human friends, Fred Jones, Daphne Blake, Velma Dinkley, and Shaggy Rogers, the latter who Scooby hangs out with a lot, even when the gang split up during their mystery-solving escapades. Also, speaking of the characters, each of them have their own personalities that make them likable in each and every way, with Scooby being the cowardly yet lovable and goofy Great Dane who can still pull through even in spite of his cowardice, Shaggy, who is Scooby's best friend, who is just as equally cowardly as Scooby is, but can also be brave when he's pushed enough times, Fred being the leader of the group who comes up with plans on how to catch the villains, Velma being the smart one of the group who comes up with deductions that are pivotal to solving the mystery, and Daphne being the fashionable one of the group who has a pretty good intuition, though she also has a tendency to be a damsel in distress, earlier episodes of the series even giving her the nickname Danger-Prone Daphne. Aside from the characters, I also like the plots of the episodes and the various mysteries that the gang would find themselves solving, especially come the second season of the show, where they would introduce pop songs that would play during the episode's chase scenes. These songs are just so toe-tapping and catchy that you can't help but want to dance along with them. But yeah, this show was a great way to introduce Scooby-Doo to audiences the world over. Because of that, it gets 9 stars from me. Now on to the second incarnation, which is the new Scooby-Doo movies, which was released in September 1972 and ran until October 1973. With the introduction of the show, there came some slight changes. For one thing, while the original Scooby-Doo Where Are You series ran for a half hour, this show was the first and only Scooby-Doo show to run for a whole hour. And also for another, this show is unique that it actually involves Scooby and the gang meeting with a weekly guest star who would often, for the most part, help the gang solve the mystery at hand. A lot of these guest stars range from celebrities like Jonathan Winters, Don Knotts, Sonny and Cher, Davy Jones, Don Adams, Tim Conway, and even Cass Elliot of all people, and other Hanna-Barbera characters like the Harlem Globetrotters, Josie and the Pussycats, Genie and Babu, and Speed Buggy. They even featured celebrities that have been dead for years, such as the Three Stooges and especially Laurel and Hardy, the latter being even more surprising, considering the fact that the real Laurel and Hardy had been dead for years, even before Scooby-Doo was first released. But they made it work by having Laurel and Hardy being voiced by sound-alikes, considering the fact that Hanna-Barbera also made an animated series based on Laurel and Hardy prior to the show. Not to mention that the show also featured animated versions of live-action characters that would also later get their own animated shows, like The Addams Family and Batman and Robin. With this show, I actually like the concept of Scooby and the gang meeting with various guest stars, especially since it's awesome the way the celebrities that guest star on the show have their likenesses animated into the show. They got every single detail on them just right, and they didn't even skip a beat. The same is also true for when they also animated the Three Stooges and Laurel and Hardy. Though granted, both the Three Stooges and Laurel and Hardy did have their own animated shows prior to the show, but it still works. In fact, Warner Brothers Animation would later revisit the concept decades later with Scooby-Doo and Guess Who, which in some ways is highly reminiscent of the show. And although it reuses the concept of Scooby and his friends meeting with various guest stars, a lot of the celebrities and animated characters that Scooby and the gang would meet were rather contemporary at the time, except for the time that they met with the characters of the Funky Phantom, which was another animated series that Hanna-Barbera produced around the same time that the new Scooby-Doo movies was about to be released. One downside of the show I can name is the fact that when the show was first released on DVD, several episodes were not included on the collection, due to the fact that several of the celebrities and characters, such as the Addams Family, were under copyright. So because of that, only 15 episodes of the series were released on DVD. The only way you can actually get a chance to see the episodes that were not released on DVD is to actually watch them on Chem Cartoon, which, for those of you who don't know, is actually the new name for Kiss Cartoon. Despite this little setback, I still enjoyed the new Scooby-Doo movies for what it is, enough to actually give it 8.5 stars. After the new Scooby-Doo movies ended, we now get the third incarnation in the Scooby-Doo franchise. The show is simply called The Scooby-Doo Show, which aired from September 1976 to December 1978. However, unlike Scooby-Doo Where Are You and the new Scooby-Doo movies, this show did not air on CBS. Instead, the franchise moved to ABC when Fred Silverman, who was the then executive president of CBS back then, actually moved to become president of ABC. Once that happened, he called up Joe Ruby and Ken Spears, who helped develop the original series, in order to develop a third Scooby-Doo series, that series becoming known as The Scooby-Doo Show. Of course, this was also around the time when Hanna-Barbera had also produced another animated series featuring a crime-fighting superhero canine as the main character, though not actually a canine, but rather a robot, which was Dynomutt Dog Wonder. Once that happened, this show and Dynomutt Dog Wonder ended up paired together, where it was known as the Scooby-Doo Dynomutt Hour, which marks the first time in Hanna-Barbera's history of having a package show that ran for an hour on network television. Even though Scooby and the gang did guest star in a few episodes of Dynomutt, this trend would continue a year later, when the second season of the show would also become paired with Laugh-O-Lympics, Dynomutt Dog Wonder, and especially Captain Caveman and the Teen Angels, where it became known as Scooby's All-Star Laugh-O-Lympics. It's especially appropriate that Scooby and Shaggy are two of the characters that are also included in Laugh-O-Lympics as part of the Scooby-Doobies team, along with Blue Falcon, Dynomutt, Captain Caveman, and the Teen Angels. Then when the third season was released, Dynomutt Dog Wonder was removed from the block, while the block was then renamed to Scooby's All-Stars. But anyway, on to the show proper. In this incarnation, Scooby and the gang are now traveling around the world while still continuing their mystery-solving adventures. I actually like the concept of Scooby and his friends traveling to different places all over the world, instead of just staying in the same location like they did in Scooby-Doo Where Are You? You actually get to see them visit such places as Canada, Salem, Massachusetts, Mexico, Puerto Rico, New York, Seattle, Washington, Alaska, England, Brazil, etc. Not only that, but this is also the very first show in the Scooby-Doo franchise to introduce a recurring character to the cast, which in this case would be Scooby's cousin Scooby Dumb, voiced by the late Daws Butler, while Scooby himself was voiced by the late Don Messick. But anyway, Scooby Dumb is depicted as being not as cowardly as Scooby and Shaggy are, yet he has a tendency to be rather headstrong, albeit rather dim-witted as well, in almost a similar vein as that of Quick Draw McGraw. I found him to be a rather okay character, though the only downside is that he only appeared in 4 episodes of the show. It was a real missed opportunity to have Scooby Dumb appear more frequently in the show, after he was first introduced in the episode where the gang traveled to the Hokey Fanoki Swamp, yes, that's what they called it in the show, to solve a mystery involving a monster called the Gator Ghoul. However, this would not be the last Scooby-Doo series to feature a relative of Scooby as a prominent character, but we'll get to him once I talk about the next show in the franchise. But anyway, unlike the previous 2 Scooby-Doo shows, this show is notably more darker in tone, being that the monsters and ghosts are more menacing and more willing to try and do away with the characters, not unlike that of Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated from what I heard. And not to mention that also unlike the previous 2 series, this series doesn't have any musical numbers during the chase scenes, nor does it have the gang meeting up with various guest stars. You could tell that Joe Ruby and Ken Spears were really starting to add darker moments into the series, much like they would later do when they produced Scruffy for the ABC Weekend special several years later. I have to admit that even in spite of the sometimes creepy and unsettling moments in this incarnation, it's a show that I've watched rather frequently, whether it was on home video or when it was reran on Cartoon Network and Boomerang. But either way, I will give the Scooby-Doo show 8 stars. Around the time that the Scooby-Doo show had ended after its 3rd season, the Scooby-Doo franchise had started to wane in popularity due to the fans starting to get tired of how repetitive the mystery-solving formula of the franchise was becoming. Then in 1979, which marked the 10th anniversary of Scooby-Doo's inception, William Hanna, Joseph Barbera, and Iwao Takamoto worked together to create a new character that would accompany Scooby and the rest of the gang on their adventures. That character being none other than Scooby's nephew, Scrappy-Doo. Scrappy is basically the opposite of Scooby, being that he is more brave and rather feisty, as well as being rather reckless, especially when he tries to face off against anyone who is bigger than he is. Once Scrappy was introduced, the 4th incarnation of the franchise became known as Scooby-Doo and Scrappy-Doo, which was released in September 1979 and ended in January 1980. With the inclusion of Scrappy-Doo, the Scooby-Doo franchise ended up getting its second wind, and interest in the franchise became reinvigorated. Just like the previous shows, the series focuses on Scooby and the gang, along with Scrappy, traveling to different places and solving mysteries. I actually like it, because Scrappy feels like that he really fits in with the Mystery Inc. gang, and a lot of fans actually agreed with the assessment, while there were a lot of other people that didn't like Scrappy because they thought that he was too feisty and reckless. And yeah, he is, but that's kind of the point of his character. The first season of the show had 16 episodes that focused on Scooby, Scrappy, and the gang solving mysteries while traveling from place to place, but that all began to change come 1980. More changes were made to the franchise, such as removing Fred, Daphne, and Velma from the cast so that the show would put more emphasis on Shaggy, Scooby, and Scrappy going on their own adventures, and even have them encounter actual ghosts and monsters, as opposed to the previous shows where the ghosts and monsters turned out to be people wearing masks. A lot of people consider this aspect of the show to be separate, but I count it as part of the Scooby-Doo and Scrappy-Doo show, no matter what you say. With this show, it also ended up getting paired with other Hanna-Barbera shows, with one exception. In 1980, the show was paired with Hanna-Barbera's version of Richie Rich and was known as the Richie Rich Scooby-Doo Show. Then in 1982, the show was also paired with Ruby Spears' The Puppy's Further Adventures, which was a spin-off of their adaptation of The Puppy Who Wanted a Boy, and the blog became known as the Scooby and Scrappy-Doo Puppy Hour. These shows were very mixed, because aside from focusing on Shaggy, Scooby, and Scrappy, there was also a series of shorts where Scrappy would hang out with Yabba Doo, who was Scooby's brother, and Yabba's master, Deputy Dusty, living in a Wild West town, where they would deal with any kind of threat that came to their little town. These shorts were not as good as the ones where Scrappy is with Shaggy and Scooby, because aside from the title sequence for the Scooby and Scrappy-Doo Puppy Hour, we never see Shaggy and Scooby together with Deputy Dusty and Yabba Doo. Yeah, my thoughts on the show are rather mixed, so it gets 7.5 stars. Alright, here we go with the 5th incarnation of Scooby-Doo, as well as the second series to feature Scrappy-Doo as a prominent character. It's the new Scooby and Scrappy-Doo show, first released in September 1983 and ended in December 1983. For this version, the Hanna-Barbera team attempted to combine together elements from both Scooby-Doo Where Are You and Scooby-Doo and Scrappy-Doo, bringing back the mystery-solving formula of the franchise and especially bringing back Daphne as a prominent character. However, Fred and Velma still remained AWOL from this version, which I thought made the show rather weak. Though to be fair, they did try to make Daphne a bit more competent than how she was portrayed in the previous Scooby-Doo shows, making her come across as being a composite character of both Fred and Velma. And as for Scrappy, at least they toned down his character so that he's not as feisty as he was in the previous show. Just like the previous show, which contained 3 7-minute segments, this show is comprised of 2 11-minute segments involving Shaggy, Scooby, Daphne, and Scrappy solving mysteries, with the exception of the episodes Where's Scooby-Doo and Wedding Bell Blues. Another thing to note is that this is the second animated series that Tom Ruegger, who would later go on to team up with Steven Spielberg to create Tiny Toon Adventures, worked on, after he got to start working on Scooby-Doo and Scrappy-Doo. In fact, he actually got to start working at Hanna-Barbera before he would go on to work for Warner Brothers Animation. But anyway, the plot for the show isn't anything special, other than bringing back the mystery-solving formula, though this time Scooby, Shaggy, Daphne, and Scrappy solve mysteries under the cover of being reporters for a teen magazine. And especially the absence of Fred and Velma from the series, which I thought made this version weaker than the previous incarnations. There's not much else to say about the new Scooby and Scrappy-Doo show, so because of that, it gets 6 stars. And now for the 6th incarnation of the Scooby-Doo franchise, and the third to feature Scrappy-Doo as a prominent character. It's the new Scooby-Doo Mysteries. No, this is not in any way related to the new Scooby-Doo movies, as the title of the show is slightly different than that of the new Scooby-Doo movies. The show was first released in September 1984 until ending in December 1984. The show is actually a continuation of the new Scooby and Scrappy-Doo show, even following the basic premise with having Shaggy, Scooby, Daphne, and Scrappy as the pivotal characters. However, there's actually an upside to this incarnation of the franchise. They actually brought back Fred and Velma after being completely absent from the show for 5 years, though they just had them be guest characters in a few episodes, appearing together in 3 episodes, or even having one appear without the other in a few episodes. The premise for the show is slightly better than that of the previous show, but like the previous show, it still isn't anything special thanks to the limited appearances of Fred and Velma as actual characters in the show. Despite this, it still gets a slightly better score from me, that score being 7 stars. Now for this series, that's when Hanna-Barbera decided to break tradition with the whole mystery-solving aspect as well as the whole people in masks angle that's been utilized a lot throughout the whole franchise's history. That's right, the 7th incarnation of Scooby-Doo is none other than The 13 Ghosts of Scooby-Doo, which was released in September 1985 and ended in December 1985. This series is radically different from all the previous incarnations, the reason being that while Shaggy, Scooby, Daphne, and Scrappy are once again the main characters of the show, Fred and Velma are once again removed from the franchise, instead being replaced by 2 new characters that were created specifically for the show. Those characters are Flim Flam, a young con artist boy, and Vincent Van Ghoul, a warlock who gives the gang instructions on how to capture the 13 different ghosts and demons that have been released. The reason for this is because in the very first episode, the gang end up landing in Tibet when they were supposed to be going to Honolulu. Once they've landed in Tibet, they get tricked into opening a forbidden chest known as the Chest of Demons, which unleashes 13 various ghosts that are said to be the most terrifying and powerful entities to ever exist. Because of that, it's up to Scooby and the gang, along with their new friend Flim Flam, to try and recapture each and every single one of the various ghosts before they can wreak havoc on the entire world. Unfortunately, the show ended on a cliffhanger before the 13th demon can be caught, until Scooby-Doo and the Curse of the 13th Ghost was released over 3 decades later. Also, this is actually the 4th and final series in the Scooby-Doo franchise to feature Scrappy-Doo as a main character, while 3 of the films in the Hanna-Barbera Superstars tin, which are Scooby-Doo Meets the Boo Brothers, Scooby-Doo and the Ghoul School, and Scooby-Doo and the Reluctant Werewolf, were also the last Scooby-Doo projects to feature Scrappy in animated form. This was because around the time, a lot of people were starting to complain about how Scrappy is portrayed as being too feisty and reckless for his own good, seeing it as one of the biggest weak points of his character, which is one of the reasons why he hasn't been in any new Scooby-Doo content for years since then, aside from some cameos for the purpose of slamming him. In fact, the live-action Scooby-Doo film actually took a pot shot at Scrappy by turning him into the main villain of the film, due to James Gunn, one of the writers for the film, harboring a dislike for the character, even though this ended up tarnishing Scrappy's reputation exponentially. Unless the writers and the producers want to bring back Scrappy and try to portray him in a more positive light so that he can actually redeem himself, not just to Scooby and the gang, but also to the fans of the franchise as well, it seems like that might not ever happen. People really need to realize that if it hadn't been for Scrappy being introduced, then the Scooby-Doo franchise wouldn't still be thriving today. But anyway, back to the show. I thought that the show was the weakest of all the previous Scooby-Doo series for a number of reasons. The whole chasing after demons aspect felt like a complete left turn from what the franchise usually stuck with. The plots are very weak and not believable enough, and even the new characters that were created seemed very flat and one note. Flim Flam is just a typical con artist. Vincent Van Ghoul just felt like a stereotypical mentor type, though the only thing that fans liked about him was the fact that he was voiced by Vincent Price. And also Bogle and Weird, the two ghosts that try to stop the gang from capturing the ghost, just felt like stereotypical screw-up bad guys that can't succeed at anything, almost like what the Team Rocket trio from Pokemon would later become. In short, I think it's safe to say that the show gets the lowest score of any Scooby-Doo show that I've ever reviewed, which is 4 stars. Come 1988, this was when Tom Ruegger decided to put a different spin on the Scooby-Doo franchise with the 8th incarnation of the franchise. Starting in the 80s, there were quite a few animated series that featured younger versions of already existing characters, which were Muppet Babies, which featured infant and toddler versions of the Muppet Show Muppets, the new Archies, which featured Archie and the gang as preteens, and the Flintstone Kids, which featured younger versions of Fred, Wilma, Barney, and Betty, as well as a few other recurring characters from the series, along with new ones that were not in the original Flintstone series. For this one, Hanna-Barbera decided to have Scooby and the gang hop on the bandwagon with Tom Ruegger at the helm, and so they came up with a pup named Scooby-Doo, which aired from September 1988 to August 1991, as well as this being the last Scooby-Doo series to ever air on ABC. The series not only focuses on the childhood of Scooby and his friends, but it also brings back the mystery-solving aspect from the original Scooby-Doo Where Are You series. However, this series could also be seen as a parody of the previous Scooby-Doo shows, with the characters being animated in a more cartoony fashion than the previous series, having the monsters and ghosts that the gang encounter be more comedic and nonsensical, and even having the characters being complete parodies of how they're normally portrayed, with the exceptions of Shaggy and Scooby, of course. For this series, Fred, or Freddy as he's known in the series, is depicted as being rather standoffish, yet not very bright and not that good of a leader as well as being a conspiracy theorist. Daphne is depicted as being a stuck-up snob who hates getting dirty due to coming from a rich family and especially having a disbelief in ghosts and monsters, which is a noticeable contradiction from her normal characterization. And finally, Velma is depicted as being the youngest member of the group and not speaking very much, except for when she says her famous catchphrase, Jinkies, to indicate the discovery of a clue, and also when conveying her discoveries that solve the mysteries. Like the 13 Ghosts of Scooby-Doo, this series also introduces a character that was created specifically for the series. That character would be Red Herring, whose name is a play on Red Herring, for the purpose of there being someone for Freddy to blame the ensuing crime on, despite the fact that Red had nothing to do with it. Though to be fair, Red was a bully type who would often cause trouble, but even in spite of all that, he is still exempt from the usual suspects pivotal to the mystery. The only exception to this was in the episode Night of the Boogie Biker, where the gang have to solve the mystery of a stolen motorbike while also having to deal with the titular ghostly biker, while at the same time Freddy ends up accepting a bet that he wouldn't accuse Red Herring of anything for the next 24 hours, with the others assuming that doing so would help him break the habit. So the gang go through the usual hijinks while trying to solve the mystery, and surprise, surprise, it turns out that Red Herring really was the ghost the whole time. And to say that Freddy was not happy upon discovering this would be an understatement. But yeah, even though the series is a parody of all the tropes and elements that you can find in almost all of the Scooby-Doo series, this is a massive improvement over the 13 Ghosts of Scooby-Doo. I say this because not only does the series return to the regular formula of solving mysteries, but it also brings back Fred and Velma as main characters. Though to be fair, the series is supposed to take place during the late 50s, early 60s, since it shows the characters as children. And also for the first time since Scooby-Doo Where Are You second season, this show also brings back having musical numbers played during the chase scenes that take place within the series. However, unlike Scooby-Doo Where Are You, the songs that play during the chase scenes each describe the ghost or monster that's chasing after the gang, while each of the gang have their own dance cycles, not unlike those from A Charlie Brown Christmas, with even the ghost or monster getting in on the act as well. I say bravo to Tom Ruegger and animator Glenn Kennedy for coming up with a fun and entertaining entry in the Scooby-Doo franchise, as well as a return to the franchise's pivotal formula. So for this, a pup named Scooby-Doo gets 9 stars. After a little over a decade of not having any new Scooby-Doo shows airing on television, Warner Brothers Animation tried their hand at making a brand new Scooby-Doo series after producing 4 direct-to-video Scooby-Doo films, which were Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island, Scooby-Doo and the Witch's Ghost, Scooby-Doo and the Alien Invaders, and Scooby-Doo and the Cyber Chase. That's because this was around the time that Hanna-Barbera, the studio that first created Scooby-Doo, had gotten absorbed into Warner Brothers Animation, which was also around the time that William Hanna died as well. So for the 9th incarnation of the Scooby-Doo franchise, we got What's New Scooby-Doo, which aired from September 2002 to July 2006, as well as this being the first Scooby-Doo series to not air on network television, but rather on a cable channel, which would be Kids WB, which was a part of the WB network, which unfortunately is not around anymore and was retooled into the CW. Anyway, this series still follows the basic formula of the original Scooby-Doo Where Are You series, albeit being a modernized take on the franchise, while also having some of the parodic elements that were previously used in A Pup Named Scooby-Doo, such as Fred not being as intelligent as he was in the previous series, and Velma's intelligence and deduction abilities being amped up to 11. Not to mention that this was also the first series in the franchise where Scooby-Doo is not voiced by Don Messick, since Messick had died back in 1997, a year before Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island was released. Starting with this series, Scooby-Doo is now voiced by Frank Welker, who also voices Fred, and he actually did a pretty decent job voicing Scooby-Doo, about as good as when he voiced Ray Stantz and Slimer in The Real Ghostbusters, or even Socrates in Adventures from the Book of Virtues. However, even with this return of Scooby-Doo to television, it's not as good as Scooby-Doo Where Are You or as funny and parodic as A Pup Named Scooby-Doo, but at least it's not as bad as the 13 Ghosts of Scooby-Doo, because at least the show is a lot more bearable compared to the 13 Ghosts of Scooby-Doo. There isn't really much else to say about the show, so it gets a pretty decent 7 stars from me. Well, there you have it, folks. Some mini reviews of each and every single one of the first 9 shows in the Scooby-Doo franchise. I mean, yeah, after What's New Scooby-Doo ended, Warner Brothers Animation still produced more Scooby-Doo shows in the years after, such as Shaggy and Scooby-Doo Get a Clue, Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated, Be Cool Scooby-Doo, and Scooby-Doo and Guess Who, as I mentioned earlier. Some were better than others, but I've not really seen any of them or seen much of them to actually give my thoughts on them. And then there's the fact that after the merger between Warner Brothers and Discovery, they came out with that Velma series, which I heard is absolutely terrible, because all it is basically an adult-filled take on the beloved franchise that we've all come to know and love. And Scooby isn't even anywhere in sight in that series at all. I mean, how can you have a Scooby-Doo series without Scooby in the series itself? I mean, omitting Scrappy from the series entirely I can understand, aside from a few cameos, but not having Scooby himself in the series, that is not a very good move. Although, to be fair, there was that Garfield minus Garfield strip that was basically a take on the Garfield strip, except Garfield was completely taken out of the strip so that it just looked like that John was talking to himself. But with the Velma series, that is just an insult to the Scooby-Doo franchise. I just hope that if Warner Brothers does plan on making a new Scooby-Doo series after Velma ends, that they'll actually bring Scooby back and return to the family-friendly format that the franchise has always been known for. Well, now that that's all been said and done, I hope that you all enjoyed this episode of Cave Cats movie and TV reviews. As I keep saying, be sure to like and subscribe to my channel for more episodes or whatever videos that I might come up with in the future. So until next time, later! And also, as Scooby would say, Scooby-Dooby-Doo!